Well, good afternoon, everyone. We are going to get started. Sorry for a slightly late start, but we're just waiting for some of the media to come in. The panel discussion is being live streamed, so if anybody wants the address, it is available here, and recordings would be available afterwards as well. Thank you for attending today. The purpose of this event is to, just before the UAE Universal Periodic Review takes place this afternoon, to highlight some of the key issues that we say should be addressed in that meeting, and of course thereafter as well. They are fundamental human rights questions, ones that affect all of us, whether we are citizens of the UAE, officials in the government, or citizens of other countries, and importantly, government officials from other countries who have responsibilities to work with their fellow states and fellow governments to address these questions. We are focusing today specifically on the situation of detention and the court system in the UAE. There are many other questions that need to be addressed, but this is a matter that we wish to highlight, and we are aware that many states in their questions to the UAE that will have to be addressed today have raised these issues. Because this is not just something that arises today, but there is a long history of allegations and proven allegations of human rights abuses occurring in detention being arbitrary in many respects in the UAE, and then in the court system that follows persons being detained, the rights of accused persons not being fully upheld. My name is Rodney Dixon. I am a lawyer who works in the human rights field and act on behalf of Dr. Al-Jada, who is here today, in respect of his situation specifically. He will describe to you what happened, because it's no use for me as a lawyer to go through it. You need to hear today from those people who have experienced it directly. This is meant to be the inside story on what is happening from those people who have themselves had to go through it. These are often stories that you won't hear discussed in the UPR or generally, but they're the ones that really count. This is not about window dressing, about presenting an image that is distorted. It's about trying to find the truth, which is important for all of us as citizens, as human rights defenders, and most importantly, as governments. I wanted to just highlight a few things which we have undertaken in the United Kingdom in respect of Dr. Al-Jada's case, and that of his two colleagues, Mr. Hamid Al-Hamadi and Mr. Yusuf Al-Mullah, three Qatari nationals who were detained from 2013 through to 2015 at different times in the UAE, and were finally released as a result of an arrangement that occurred between the governments of Qatar and the UAE. You will hear that they experienced truly horrific circumstances while detained, and a similar pattern which we've heard in respect of other detainees as well, which was first being taken to secret prisons which are not monitored, held in incommunicado detention, no access to lawyers. And in that period, a systematic effort being made to break the person, so that what they would be prepared to do under the promise of being released is sign confessions. Those confessions could then be used once persons were brought out of the secret prisons to the regular prisons in the trial proceedings that followed. And the UN Working Group on Arbitrary Detention has noted that in Dr. Al-Jada's case, that his conviction was based solely on the confessions that he was forced to sign, there being no other credible evidence. That was the process that was followed him and with my other two clients as well. A very similar experience you'll hear thereafter from David Haig, with Toby Cadman, his lawyer, being present today, who will discuss that case. It's a reoccurring pattern which is of grave concern and which has most recently been highlighted by the UN Human Rights High Commissioner for Human Rights, who has, in advance of the UPR today, raised very serious questions about the system that is in place in the UAE, starting with the crimes themselves, which he has highlighted are very vague, particularly in relation to alleged offences of terrorism, highlighting in particular that the laws allow for action to take place, and even for the death penalty to follow, if it can be shown that the person concerned undermined national unity or social peace. Those terms are not defined. There's no legal definition, and you can imagine that they can therefore be manipulated to cover any situation. Laws have to be clear and well defined in any society. And the High Commission has gone on to say that when laws are so vague, if they are then implemented arbitrarily, the detention that results is unlawful. And then, if as a result of that, because there isn't the evidence to support the crimes, confessions are tortured out of people, and then that is relied upon in courts of law, that is to be condemned and stopped immediately. No one is saying that where there is evidence that proves that somebody is a terrorist, that they shouldn't be properly investigated and prosecuted. That's vital around the world. But what cannot be tolerated in any society that espouses the rule of law is where there's no evidence to simply make it up or to harm people brutally in order to obtain so-called evidence that is then relied upon. That undermines the entire system of law which is there to stop terrorism in the first place, and ultimately fuels terrorism and activity, doesn't do anything to stop it. So that is why it's so important for the rule of law to be implemented thoroughly and consistently, because that's what will ultimately make our societies safer and more peaceful. The situation in the UK is that the police, as a result of the case that we have brought before them, are currently looking into the allegations that we've put before them, because they have the power under UK law, and it exists in a number of countries, including here in Switzerland as well, to, if there's evidence of torture, irrespective of who the person is or where it was committed, if the person comes to the UK, they are entitled to arrest the person, question them, and if there is sufficient evidence, to take the case forward to prosecution. It's what is called universal jurisdiction. The precedent was established in the famous Pinochet case and has been used in other cases thereafter. So it has to be underlined, this is not a case against the UAE, it's not a witch hunt, it's not trying to single them out. This is laws that applies to all countries, and persons who have come from many parts of the world have been subject to it. And likewise, British citizens, British forces should be subject to it as well. It's there to apply equally to all persons who are alleged to have committed torture, if, underlining if, there is proper evidence of that. And we say in our case there is. We've supplied that to the police. Of course they have to look further into it, which they are currently doing at the moment. And we have also supplied them with information about certain suspects, persons who are in official positions, who were involved in these acts, either directly or because of their position of authority. We have jurisdiction over crimes committed as a result of command responsibility. So that's somebody who is a superior in charge of subordinates. If they fail to prevent torture happening, then they can be prosecuted for those crimes. And those persons, if they do travel to the UK, could be questioned and arrested depending on the available evidence. What is also important in this case to highlight is that when my clients were released in 2015, their confessions then, which were recorded by the authorities, were not made public. They were only made public in June of 2017, 2 years after, when everyone thought that this had gone away, that a settlement had been reached and it was possible to move on. But you will know that in that time period, the UAE, together with others, were part of an alliance to blockade Qatar. And we say it was very significant that these recorded confessions were released just at that time in an effort to try and show that the blockade of Qatar was justified, because here you had people confessing to subversive or terrorist acts. Now that may be a very significant piece of evidence looked at from a legal point of view, why that was released then, and it may also show the involvement of those much higher up in the UAE national authorities to have timed it in that way and to use it for much higher national political interests. But those will be matters that will have to be further investigated by the police. But a startling development, you might think, for confessions like that to be released much later, when they'd been based on torture in the first place, unfounded, and when the matter had essentially been settled, for it to be dug up again. And it just shows how dangerous it is for these kinds of activities to take place, because they're not over. Even if you think you've reached the end of the road, they can always be used in a detrimental fashion again. We will highlight today what steps we think should be taken. Now, I've highlighted one, which is a recent development of national action being taken by police forces. That's a very practical measure. But of course, beyond that, states have a duty to, amongst each other, stop these kind of practices. I'm firmly of the view that if in the Security Council or amongst key states there was no green light, whether direct or indirect, given to these kinds of activities continuing, they would be stamped out. We've seen that when key states act and try and stop activities, it very often does work. But they've got to mean it, they've got to follow it through. And that is vital, especially for the UN today, but thereafter as well in the General Assembly and the Security Council. So that is the plea that we are making. Yes, investigations and prosecutions, but to stop the cycle, states need to act collectively and together. Not by singling out certain as worse than others, by stopping torture across the board as a means of in some way trying to obtain convictions or under false pretenses combat terrorism, when really what is happening is that opponents, human rights activists, whether we agree with their views or not, are being marginalized and brutalized. I want to end off just with a short quote from the famous French philosopher Sartre, who, when he was commenting on the crimes committed by the French in the war in Algeria, said that the real tragedy in our time is that any of us can be interchangeably victim or torturer. And what he was underlining was that in an interconnected world where interests shift and change so rapidly, we have to be so aware of how power can be misused. We might think we can do it and get away with it, but it can be turned on us because we've established the precedent. The reason why we oppose torture is so that those who have been brutalized will never suffer that again. But so too will it not be implemented on us. It's about our common humanity and understanding that interconnection. And that's why it's so vital that in these kinds of forums, and in the forums where we can implement change, we use that as our motivation, always. I'm now going to hand over to Dr. Al-Jada and then David Haig, who will give you their inside experiences, ones that we say should be brought to the fore at these kinds of forums.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. It is my pleasure to be with you today. I am here really not against any country, but to expose what happened to me. And I am not going to add anything and not exaggerate anything. I am Dr. Mahmoud Al-Jada, Qatari nationality, 55 years old. I have been arrested in UAE, Dubai airport on 26th of February 2013 while I was traveling to Doha, came from Thailand. Unfortunately, since I have been arrested, with not showing any evidence that I should be arrested from the public prosecution, I don't know the person who talked to me. He didn't show me that he's a policeman. Just he asked me to come with him to a room and started interviewing me and asked me for a letter, for a money. He looked everywhere. He didn't find anything. They brought my luggage from the plane. They started investigating. They didn't find anything. So he told me, just we want you to sign a paper. Come with us to the police station to sign the papers and we will release you. First, really, I refused because the plane will take off. He said, we will delay the plane, don't worry. So I went with him. All of a sudden, I found myself in a GMC, black GMC car, all covered by black, all the windows. They tied my hands and they make me blindfold and tied my feet. Dried me for mostly 1.5 hours. I don't have a watch that time. Then, initial case, I was really shocked. I was feeling fear. I don't know what I will do. I am thinking all the way what I did to be arrested and what will happen to me. For 3 days continuously, there was continuous interview. They didn't allow me to sleep for a single minute. They threatened me during the interview. If you are not saying what we want as we like, we are going to pull your nails. We are going to hang you upside down. And even if we kill you, nobody know about you. In fact, I was very afraid and anxious, and I started asking them, I want my ambassador, I want my lawyer. They said, later you will see your ambassador, not now. But one of them, he swore that if I inform them whatever they like, within 5 days, he said, I will drop you to the airport and take you there. So really I believed, and I start, whenever they ask me, and I said the truth, but they don't like it, they start slapping me in my face. They punch me in my tummy. They have a stick. They keep beating me by the stick. There was bruises in my legs, and only right legs. Whenever I said something they don't like, they start to beating me by a stick. And they keep me lying down on my tummy and lift my feet, and they beating me in the feet. So I found myself in a very bad situation. I decided that I will tell them whatever they like. And frankly, I said, please write whatever you like, and I will sign it. But release me and let me go to my family. My wife, she was in the hospital at the same time when I was arrested. And this is the reason brought me from Thailand. So I was arrested for 27 months. I was released on 22nd of May 2015. 8.5 months of this period, I was isolated in solitary confinement. I was blindfolded all the time, except when I was in my cell. All this happened without any charges. They didn't show single evidence about their complaint. They said I am supporting the Muslim Brotherhood by money, and I swear I never entered single riyal or single dollar to UAE. And they didn't prove it by anything, but just saying this is. So under a force, I have signed something I don't know really. They brought 35 pages. They asked me to sign it without seeing what is inside it. And I signed it. And they told me, you are going to be released. So I was very happy that night. Day 14 from my arrest, when they arrested me, the 14 days after that, at 9:30 p.m., I asked them, because what is the time? But I don't have watch. I don't know the timing. Yani. But 9:30 p.m., one person, they took me to a room. They asked me to wear my traditional clothes. And they told me, we are going to do interview with you in video film. So I refused. He kept the Holy Quran, and he swear that if you did this interview tomorrow, you will have your dinner with your family. So really, I accepted that. And they were leading me what I should say. They said, talk about this person in the interview. And I said, something is right, something is not really, but I want to be released. And this is the bad situation, that my target to be released, whatever I said and whatever I signed. I was in very bad situation really. Because of that, I accepted that. During the period, 8.5 months, I started to have bleeding. I have bleeding PR, and I complained to their clinic. They have a clinic, which is very limited, run by a nurse. I told him I need a medical doctor because I have bleeding. He said, it's a simple thing. I told him, no, I am special case. My dad passed away because of colon carcinoma, so I have very high chance to have it. So after I complained, for 52 days, nobody replied. Then after that, they referred me to the hospital. They admitted me, and they did colonoscopy in Sheikh Zayed Hospital, military hospital. They found a small tumor, which is a pre-cancer. They told it pre-cancer. It is not a cancer, but there is dysplasia, they call it, which is that cells has started to be a cancer. I asked for Human Rights Association. They told me this Human Rights Association will do the things more complicated and will not do anything. I asked them, please transfer me to a public person, Al-Wathba or Razin. They said, don't be, the person he is talking to me as advisor. He said, if you go there, you will be, you keep you with one drug addict or one human homosexual, or so they were talking. I said, even please transfer me, but they didn't transfer me. So I was for 8.5 months in the solitary confinement. Post-trauma after I have been released, really, during my 8 months, I start to have severe depression, and they started me antidepressant to prevent me harming myself. And when they, after 8.5 months, they transfer me from the solitary confinement secret prison to the public. They didn't transfer with me my medication, and it was not available on the other side. So one of the side effects of this medication, insomnia. So I have insomnia for 3 days again. So in the beginning, 3 days, they didn't allow me to sleep. And when they transfer me, another 3 days of insomnia, I have suffered from it. After they have released me, I found myself withdrawing from the community. I feel people talking about me badly because their media started to talk about me. I cannot travel to some of places. I went to Bahrain, they returned me back. Even my brothers and sisters in Bahrain, but they don't allow me to enter. I want to visit Kuwait, they don't allow me because they said there was a request from UAE for you not to enter these countries. The other effect in my work, I was away from my normal life for 27 months, which has affected badly in my life. My family is, they arrested my son from the court. They took him from front of me in the court. They arrested him for one night because one video film came out and my son was talking that my dad did nothing. So they take another film for him by force, and he said, no, my father used to support the Muslim Brotherhood by money. So whatever they, especially the media, it's very sensitive to them, and they want to approve what they believe, not what is the fact. This is some of what happened to me, and I cannot summarize 27 months within 5 or 10 minutes, but really I suffered a lot. And the other Qataris, the other 2 Qataris also, which were arrested, one of them have been arrested for 11 months, and one of them 9 months without any charges. After 9 months, the first one have been released without send him to the court, without any charges, and they ask him to drive to Qatar. So they keep him 9 months with anything. The other one, they take him to the court, and they said he's supporting Qatar, or there is a conflict between them, and they give him 10 years. After 3 days, they released him. The other Qataris, he said that he was threatened to be used homosexual, to be naked, and keep him naked, and they asked him to be, but they didn't. They keep him in electric chair, and they give just for a few seconds an electric shock. For me, they keep me in the chair, but they didn't. They never give me electric shock. This is in brief what happened to me, and thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Jeddah. Good afternoon, everyone. Oh, yeah. That's a good start. Good afternoon, everyone. For those that don't know me and haven't yet heard my story about what happened to me in the UAE, my name is David Haig. On Friday, myself, Dr. Al-Jada beside me, and several others gave a press conference at the Geneva Press Club. That conference was to announce the formation of an association over something we all had in common. We are an unlikely group of colleagues, separated by age, nationality, religion and profession. We were 3 businessmen and a medical doctor, 1 Qatari, 1 Lebanese American, 1 Syrian, and myself a Brit. We did, however, have 2 things in common. We are all the victims of torture by the UAE, and we are all determined to bring to justice those in the UAE that use torture. We came together last week to form the Association of Victims of Torture of the UAE here in Geneva, because it was clear to us, numerous NGOs and lawyers and politicians, that there is sadly a desperate need to support those who have been and are currently being tortured by the UAE, and to campaign for an end to torture in the UAE, as well as to highlight each and every case of torture. I wanted to tell you a little bit about my case. In doing that, to show that torture by the UAE happens to everyday, normal people. I am not a terrorist, I'm not a journalist, I was not a human rights activist then. I was a lawyer running a football club. I'd never even been involved with the police in my own country or any other country. I was a very normal person like every one of you. 4 years ago, I was the managing director of Leeds United, a leading English football club. Life was good. I saw Dubai very much as a second home, and I'd put together a consortium that was in the process of buying Leeds United from its Dubai-based owners. I had no idea that what should have been a straightforward business deal would very quickly destroy my life. That I was about to be set up and tricked to fly to a country where torture would be used against me by an unscrupulous company using the most extreme litigation tactic. The deal that we had been working on turned sour, and in the middle of this dispute I was tricked to fly to the UAE. I thought I was going to Dubai to meet the UAE owners and resolve the dispute. However, within hours of stepping off the plane, I was imprisoned as part of a premeditated trap, and I would spend the next 22 months of my life detained in Dubai. I now know the people that I was doing business with, people who had direct connections to the UAE government, were complicit in this. I was told to sign a confession and a settlement agreement within days of my imprisonment, and told that if I did so, I could leave, or if I refused, that I would spend the rest of my life behind bars in the UAE prisons. The abuses I suffered during that time were so serious that upon my return to England, I've been hospitalised for 7 months as an inpatient. It has taken 22 months to date in England to start to rebuild my life, my mind, as well as my broken body. I'm here today with you to tell the world what happened to me in that very dark Dubai, in the hope of exposing the ongoing suffering in the UAE jails, and to warn others of the terrible injustices that exist within the UAE legal system. I can tell you that the most basic human rights are denied to detainees and prisoners in the UAE. After I was arrested, I was detained without charge or investigation for 15 months, and most of the physical abuse occurred during this time. During my incarceration, I was denied the opportunity to see the evidence against me, either before or during the so-called trial. I was not even allowed to give evidence myself, or to cross-examine witnesses, or even to speak to the judge. Often, I wouldn't even be allowed in the court. I was regularly denied access to a translator and a lawyer, and often even a pen and paper. I was only able to fully read the accusations against me some 22 months later, when I had returned home to England. These issues go straight to the heart of the UAE's human rights record, which this United Nations Universal Review is examining here in this building, and which the UAE is trying its hardest to cover up. Given my own personal experience, it will come as no surprise that I focus purely on the United Arab Emirates. It is important that pressure on regimes with dubious human rights practices remains factually based, and therefore I believe that I and my colleagues like Dr. Al-Jada are best placed to focus on the UAE, as that is the country where we have direct personal experience, and where now I have already represented hundreds of people trapped and detained in its legal and prison system, many also the victims of torture. Today, the periodic review of the UAE begins in this great building, and I hope today that the United Nations take a stand against the UAE's arrogance and total disdain for international human rights law. I, my lawyers and the UK Foreign Office have repeatedly sought meetings with the UAE to discuss its treatment of me. The UAE lied to the Foreign Office, telling them that I have never complained about my treatment, yet we have countless copy letters proving otherwise. Thereafter, the UAE has simply ignored all requests from us for a meeting. Even this week we reached out to the UAE, yet no response. Censorship, silence and misinformation is something used continually by the UAE. Rather than address the problem, they seek instead to control the narrative with multi-million-pound marketing and spin budgets and donations for buildings in the United Nations. Indeed, the UAE's own mission to the UN is silent on the review here this week. You will find no release, no media, no interviews, no reports from the UAE. We only need to look at the main foyer to see the exceptional and unusual display put on by the UAE. Extraordinary in the UN, I am told. We see dates, falcons and deserts, yet not a mention of their human rights abuses. The sign at the entrance to the event says it all. Do not cross the line, area under surveillance and alarm, with security guards on tap. Each time the UAE loses an extradition case around the world, there will be no reports in their press. You will hear nothing about it. Indeed, worse than this, the UAE has now taken to issuing wholly false press releases to damage those that highlight their human rights abuses. In my own case, the Dubai DIFC courts, staffed in part by retired English judges, following a damning article on them by me in the Independent paper in England, issued a press release from the actual court wrongly stating that I was a convicted money launderer, with the implication that I should not be trusted. It of course did not say that I had actually been arrested, jailed and then acquitted of the, some would say, hardly serious crime of Twitter abuse. Met with threats of legal action for defamation, the CEO of the court that issued the release then revoked it, but the damage to me had been done. Equally fancifully and ludicrously, it seems now that anyone or any charity or NGO that raises human rights issues against the UAE is now either on the payroll of Qatar or a terrorist. I and a number of the charities and lawyers here today have had that accusation as well. In violation of all internationally recognised statutes on torture and the treatment of prisoners, the UAE continues to torture people detained in prisons, police stations and holding centres. I do not seek to suggest that every individual suffers this fate, but it occurs with sufficient frequency to draw the conclusion that it is endemic within the UAE, and therefore, even if it is not part of an officially sanctioned policy, it is certainly one that the UAE government and its ministries are prepared to ignore. Cases of the UAE's torture are becoming increasingly public and increasingly numerous. Recently, a young British citizen, Ahmed Zaidan, was convicted of offences in the UAE following confessions extracted from him by the use of torture. Lee Bradley Brown, a British tourist visiting Dubai, died in police custody following allegations that he had been beaten and tortured by the Dubai police, having been detained for 6 days. I'll never forget the chilling threats I heard in May 2014 while I was being beaten. "We kill Brits here," my abuser, a Dubai policeman, told me. I didn't know what that meant then, but I do now. I've met Brits in jail in Dubai who saw Lee's lifeless and broken body being dragged out of the solitary confinement cells in the Dubai station. That station is the same station where I spent 17 months of my life. I had been wrongly accused, arbitrarily detained, threatened, abused, starved, beaten, electrocuted and raped. It has taken me a lot of time and an awful lot of treatment to be able to talk fully about what happened to me. As a Briton, I expect more from my country, and as a human, I expect more from the international community. What happened to me has been reported to the English courts, the UAE, the United Nations, the UK Foreign Office. It has been fully accepted by the UK courts in countless UAE extradition hearings. Where then is the public condemnation of this behaviour from the UAE, the UK and the US, and from other stakeholders? Why is it that the UAE, and for that matter Saudi Arabia, Egypt and those other states that routinely partake in such activities continue to escape the condemnation of the international community? The UAE is safe in the knowledge that there is no real consequence for its actions, and therefore there is no incentive to change. 4 years on, I am still fighting for justice for myself from the UAE. Even an apology would be a start. The UK and numerous other countries, if they are truly serious in seeking to further democracy and human rights, and if they are truly serious in seeking to ensure that all citizens of all nations are free from oppression, need to dramatically change their position. Trade should not come before torture. If the UK government will not recognise the dark reality of the UAE's record on the use of torture and dangers in its legal system, thankfully the UK courts certainly do. The UK courts clearly recognise the position in the UAE. For years they have refused to extradite individuals from the UK to the UAE. To put it another way, an independent court has recognised on numerous occasions that there is a real risk of an individual being subjected to torture and or associated human rights abuses in the UAE, and therefore ought not to be extradited. I am often called to give evidence in courts in the UK, but also in Europe and even in Australia on my experiences in extradition cases. I am a first-hand witness to the zeal with which the UAE abuses Interpol and seeks the extradition of the world's citizens to its dangerous legal system. Only last week, yet another UAE extradition request was rejected by the English courts, again for a bounced cheque, this time for office rent. In another recent refusal by the UK courts, the Scottish courts refused a similar request. In that hearing, I gave evidence for 2 days and was cross-examined by the UAE in that case. The judge, Sheriff T. Welsh QC, concluded in a 70-page judgment that there was a real risk of torture and human rights abuses in the UAE, including that there was a real risk of an unfair trial. Indeed, he went further and named the extradition request a revenge extradition by a powerful Emirati whose Scottish wife, the daughter of the man he sought to extradite, had fled the marriage back to Scotland. That judge discussed my evidence to his court and in detail. His words are unequivocal and telling, and I wanted to share them with you here as they clearly set out the reality of the UAE justice system as found recently by a UK court. The judge said, "David Haig struck me as an honest, intelligent witness who gave his evidence with calm dignity. I believed him when he said he was Lord to Dubai. I believed his evidence when he indicated that high-ranking Emiratis have influence over and access to the police and other aspects of civil society. I have no doubt he was telling the truth about seeing a civilian lawyer who acted for his former employers in Dubai police station in the company of a police officer pointing at him before being questioned and beaten by police. The clear inference that the civilian lawyer had influence as to how he was badly treated and abused by the police is irresistible. I fully accept he was repeatedly, seriously assaulted by Dubai police officers and tasered while detained at Dubai police station. I accept he was interrogated and forced to sign a document in Arabic, the content of which he could not understand. Thereafter, I believed the account he gave of squalid, overcrowded and insanitary detention conditions in Dubai police station. I further believe he was sexually assaulted and raped in the car park of that police station during his detention. It cannot be correct that individuals such as me, who have suffered at the hands of such regimes, are routinely ignored in the hope that we will eventually give up and go away. My message, therefore, is this: I am not going away and I will not be silenced. We can see by the formation of the Association for Victims of Torture in the UAE, a groundbreaking step, that those like me are growing in number and are also not going away. Not only that, but I am determined to spend my future helping others facing injustice in the UAE. and I am determined to highlight each and every case of torture by the UAE and the perpetrators of it. If a UAE torturer is in one of our countries, we intend to know about it and to seek them, have them brought to justice, rather than see them shopping in Knightsbridge. It is to the international community and the United Nations that we must now look to bring the UAE out of the darkness and to hold the UAE to account for its flagrant human rights abuses. One of the strongest messages we can send to demonstrate our abhorrence of the UAE prison and justice system is to ensure that no member of our community has to face being extradited to the UAE to face this abuse. For this reason, I would ask the UN to support a recommendation to the British Prime Minister Theresa May and her government, and to governments around the world to suspend their extradition treaties with the UAE. In light of the evidence you have heard today, there is no good reason not to. If the UAE will not willingly stop its torture, then the international community must ensure that it takes its opportunity in this periodic review to create a new dawn for human rights on the horizon in the UAE. There is little point in countries signing up to human rights laws around the world to great media fanfare if they are not required to comply with them. The international community knows the UAE is torturing the world's citizens. The world needs to be told the truth of the UAE's torture. Only then, when the truth is out and the UAE can no longer control the narrative with their marketing and spin, may we see the change the UAE needs. Finally, I can see at the end of the table here today that there are UAE representatives. The first time I have seen them since I was acquitted of Twitter abuse in 2014. I would like to publicly invite them to meet with me after this session to discuss their abuse of me. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you. As David has said, I act as his legal representative, and I have the honour of representing David, who I consider to be an incredibly brave individual in trying to ensure, first of all, that what happened to him is highlighted publicly and that those individuals responsible are brought to justice, but also, as David has said in some detail, to ensure that this culture of impunity that prevails is brought to an immediate end and that no one should be subject to such treatment. I would also like to say that this is an opportunity for the UAE. This is not an indictment of the UAE. These are individual cases, well-documented and credible cases, of individuals who have been subjected to some of the worst forms of ill treatment in detention. I say it's an opportunity for the UAE because there is a dire need for a fundamental overhaul and reform of their criminal justice and penal system, and they should take that opportunity. The UPR today, as we have said and as we said on Friday at the press conference, is an opportunity for states and also for the UAE to recognise what is happening within its own criminal justice and penal system. A number of states, we hope this afternoon, will express their concerns and call on the UAE to not only sign and ratify international treaties, but actually to start to implement them. It is important that the UAE ratified the Convention Against Torture. It is disappointing that they have not submitted any report on the implementation. It is encouraging that they have allowed UN special rapporteurs to enter UAE, but there needs to be far greater engagement by the UN special procedures through the special rapporteurs and the working groups to look at the conditions of detention, to look at the fair trial concerns, to look at the lack of independence and impartiality of the judiciary. These are very serious concerns. And they're very serious concerns that the UAE have to accept because it will impact upon their tourism industry. It will impact upon companies looking to invest in the Middle East and the Gulf states. And they should take that very seriously. David has mentioned that there are British judges sitting in the courts in the UAE. They're sitting in the commercial courts, particularly the DIFC. not just British judges, there are judges from other jurisdictions, primarily retired judges. And this is a matter that we have raised with the authorities in the United Kingdom, because they are providing legitimacy and diplomatic cover for a system that we say is a flagrant denial of justice, is in violation of all human rights treaties, and is used by influential Emiratis for commercial disputes, as we've heard in the case of David Haig and other cases. David has also mentioned the question of extradition. I, along with a number of other lawyers, had called for the United Kingdom to suspend, at the very least, its extradition treaty with the United Arab Emirates. I also serve as a prosecutor in the United Kingdom. I prosecute extradition cases. I do not act for the UAE, and I would not be able to act for the UAE because it would be a conflict of interest. But I, along with a number of my colleagues, have called for the treaty to be suspended until such time as the UAE recognizes the very serious problems that it faces. When David said that for a number of years no cases, no individuals have been returned to the UAE to face trial upon their request, he didn't say the number. 13 cases. All of the last 13 cases have resulted in a refusal by British judges sitting in the extradition courts, and our High Court in the Royal Courts of Justice have refused to extradite based on fair trial concerns and allegations of ill treatment in detention. There are a number of other states that have been subject to the same level of criticism. But I'm not sure that these are the states that the UAE would like to sit side by side with. It is a matter that the UAE needs to very seriously address. As David has said, particularly in the last case, the case in Scotland, the judge, a senior judge in Scotland, found David's evidence to be highly credible, that he was an honest witness, and refused to extradite on that basis, primarily on David's evidence, but also on the basis of other human rights monitoring reports, such as Human Rights Watch, Amnesty, and a whole host of other credible international human rights organizations. Again, these are matters which the UN Special Procedures has an obligation to address, that various international organizations and committees, such as the UN monitoring bodies for the prevention of torture, have an obligation. There is also a requirement to end secret prisons. This is not justified in any society, no matter what the concerns are, regardless of whether the UAE is fighting terrorism. Human rights and fundamental freedoms and protections are absolute. We recently, I say recently, certainly within the last decade, my own country has also fought with countering terrorism and extremism in its country. And there were attempts by the government to put in place draconian laws that would remove fundamental freedoms and human rights protections. And our highest court said that it was simply not justified. And one of our most senior judges, Lord Hoffman, made a very famous statement. And I'd just like to read you a short excerpt of that. The real threat to the life of the nation, in the sense of people living in accordance with its traditional laws and political values, comes not from terrorism, but from laws such as these. It's an important statement to make. Regardless of what a person is suspected of having committed, strict adherence to the rule of law is absolutely essential. In David's case, and in Dr. Al-Jala's case, they should have recourse before the UAE courts. The UAE authorities should engage and should prosecute those that are suspected of having engaged in acts of torture where there is credible evidence to do so. As David has said, despite numerous attempts to engage with the UAE authorities, they have refused to. They have refused to acknowledge what's going on in their own courts and in their own penal facilities. So what do we do about that? Well, as both David and Dr. Al-Jada are pursuing, is cases before the British courts. Because our laws provide for the prosecution of individuals, regardless of whether the victims are British nationals or not, for acts of torture. That means that those individuals who are suspected of having carried out these acts against these two individuals and many others can be prosecuted before the British courts. And we are actively engaging with our Metropolitan Police that has a specialist unit set up to deal with such cases, and they are actively looking into these matters. And we strongly believe that charges will follow. Now, of course, we don't want to look upon this as an academic exercise. We want to see real accountability. So if the UAE is serious about their commitment to human rights, to ending impunity, and ensuring that individuals who engage in such conduct are held accountable, then they're invited to engage with the British authorities to ensure that those individuals within these facilities that are responsible for these acts are handed over to the British authorities and brought to justice. And that they take a very serious look at their own institutions to ensure that anyone, regardless of their status, within government and state institutions, are prosecuted to the full extent of the law. Because that is a requirement on them in a system that is based on democratic principles and the rule of law. And I also call upon them to engage with the UN special procedures and other institutions so that there can be prison inspections, so that there can be proper monitoring of the trials. Now, of course, we're dealing with a sovereign nation that has its own judiciary and criminal justice system. But we see monitoring of trials in all jurisdictions. We see prison inspections in all jurisdictions, including my own. None of us are above the scrutiny of the international community. And the UAE needs to understand that. Now, today we are talking about the UAE, but it's not just the UAE. There are a number of countries where we see such practices. But certainly the UAE can take a first step in acknowledging that there is a very real problem within their criminal justice system, and that this is going to have a very dire impact upon their stability. The rule of law is paramount, and we need to do everything we can to ensure that. I'd like to conclude by saying that at the press conference on Friday, when I first heard the announcement of a new association for victims of torture, I gave my full support behind that, because it is absolutely essential that all of these cases are given representation, that they are given the support that they need as victims of torture. It's not just about prosecutions and not just about accountability. These individuals have to put their lives back together. It has taken David a great deal of time to come to terms with what happened to him and to rebuild his body and his mind. What happened to him is horrifying. which should not be allowed to occur in any democratic nation. What we've heard today is a snapshot of two individuals, but they are not alone. We hear repeatedly of individuals being held without access to their families, without access to lawyers, not receiving proper legal advice, and being subjected to forms of ill treatment. And I appreciate it's not nice to hear this sitting in a room such as this when you're representing the UAE, but it is a reality. These are credible allegations that need to be dealt with properly. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you to all the speakers. We've got a little bit of time left, so if anyone wants to make a comment, as long as it's not too long, I'll invite you to do that, or any questions to any of the speakers in the remaining time, that would be much appreciated.
I'm Ahmed Shawqi. I'm a correspondent in the UN here in Geneva. I have a very short question to Mr. Haig. Just if he can clarify why after this long time he started to talk about his allegations about what has happened to him in Emirates. Thank you.
Just a clarification on your question. When you say after this long time, what is it that you're referring to?
As I understood that it's happened before 2 years or 2 years and a half, isn't?
Sorry, what precisely are you referring to? What happened?
The torture and the detained happened to you.
Yes. Now, I complained about the torture of me to the Dubai courts in writing in 2014, 2015, 2016, 2017, and now here at the United Nations in 2018. Hopefully that answers your question.
I'm just not talking about how you react with the courts there, or I'm saying why you start talking here about what has happened to you after they released you, long time after they released you. This is my question.
Again, I think you need to clarify your question, because as I've just said, I raised the issue of the torture and abuse of me with the UAE authorities throughout the years that I've just mentioned, including 2014, 2015, 2016. Copies of those letters are available should you wish to see them. In terms of why I'm here now at the UN, is it not the review of the UAE now, and it was not the review of the UAE in 2014, 2015, 2016 or 2017, hence why I am here.
Perhaps I can also, as David's legal representative, respond in part to your question as well and confirm what David has said. Both David and I have said today that we have repeatedly tried to engage with the UAE authorities. There have been numerous complaints that have been made both to the UAE authorities and the UAE judicial system. It has been repeatedly raised with the UK Foreign Office and continues to be raised with them. We have provided the Metropolitan Police with a comprehensive dossier of evidence that documents what happened to David. And as David has said today, and as I've said today, David had to go through reconstructive surgery because of the injuries that he suffered, and he's had to go through an incredible amount of psychiatric therapy as a result of the effects of torture, which is quite common with victims of torture, particularly with victims that have been subjected to this level of abuse. I'm sure you're aware there's no statute of limitations on bringing an allegation of torture, and it's important that these issues are raised. And as you know, because you were here on a previous occasion, this is not the first time that these allegations have been raised.
Other comments or questions? One other matter that I wanted to highlight was that the International Criminal Court, the ICC, which is not a body that the UAE has yet signed up to. It's amongst a small group of nations, because the numbers are ever increasing of member states of that court, is another important body that we should always have in mind when we look at accountability in the future. But also because of the principle in that court, and this is to underline the point that has been made, that we have an opportunity now, because the national jurisdiction is the place where the first step should always be taken. The international position is that that court and other courts will defer to the national system to ensure that it investigates persons responsible and holds them accountable. It's only where there's a failure or an inability or a cover-up that international institutions should be involved. And that has now become an increasing norm in international law, that states are given the first bite at it, and to make sure that their institutions are strong enough to do that. And it's where that fails that international attention is then drawn. We've all been emphasizing that we are at that point already with the UAE, but that doesn't mean, and this is to underline the point, that the national system should not take advantage of the opportunity that it has, because that is ultimately the best way to ensure accountability, and that the system is strong enough for the future as well, because it can't be done at the international level. It has to come from the core, from the root. So now's the time. Yes, countries can wait. The UAE can wait. It can be 5 years, 10 years, 20 years, 25 years. But from all of our collective experiences, I think the one lesson is that these things don't ever go away. You might be able to put them off, kick it away into the long grass for some time. But believe me, from the experience in the UK, where we've gone through massive changes in our criminal justice system over the last 50, 75 years, the issues haven't gone away. They've had to be addressed. And the calls will only get louder. It'll become more difficult. It'll look more defensive and reactive later. Better to do it now. We've got to a crossroads. Seize the chance now, because it's not going to go away. Any other final comments?
The only final point that I would make, and it's something that we have focused on, we have heard some reference to it today, and certainly it's something that we've raised with the UK government, because they consider themselves to be a bastion of human rights, is that in the current climate that we see now, with Brexit in particular, we see the UK putting trade before dealing with these very serious human rights violations. And a number of other states as well is putting trade before asking very difficult questions and pushing for fundamental reform. So this is also a call to those states that have a relationship with the UAE, that have a very important trade relationship with the UAE, and for all of those major corporations that have a base in the UAE, is that now is the time to start pushing for the fundamental reform, and to not be afraid to ask what are very, very difficult questions. And I think that's the one final message that I would say to those states who are participating in the UPR today, that is an absolutely essential drive that needs to be supported by all states.
Well, thank you then all for attending. We are available for any further questions or interviews, and there is a recording of this if you wish that to be made available and sent to you. I hope it has been informative and has sparked some ideas about things that we, all of us, can do, so that this isn't left hanging as only a discussion. It, of course, does depend on those powerful delegates of states sitting above us and what happens beyond, but it also depends on all of our actions and our collective, both thinking and then practical measures that we think we can take, so that this doesn't end here. I hope it's the start of much more. But thank you very much for attending and your time.